There we go. All right, so something I did want to start off with in this is the land care principles, which are at that link that I shared in the chat. And the website is landcarecollective.org, and this is just the what is land care. You can find this list of principles, and they are getting to know the life and ecosystem of the land we are partnering with before altering it, working to shape human activities to the land before shaping the land to human activities, seeking to always strengthen the network of life of any place that we interact with, assisting displaced life to return to the land being worked with, respecting and supporting the right of an ecosystem to progress towards complexity, understanding where the materials or energy we work with are drawn from and where they will go if or when they move beyond the site, seeking to always return more than we take and to never take beyond a system's capacity to regenerate, and acknowledging that humans are heterotrophs. We cannot photosynthesize, so we must draw our energy from the life of other beings. We owe respect and reciprocity to all those we rely on for our survival. Part of that responsibility is to not ignore or dismiss the costs of our actions. So that's a list, you know, there's always room for improvement or adjustment on that. That's sort of where I'm at right now, based on thinking about this stuff for a while. And at that link on the landcarecollective.org site, there is actually a video where I give a presentation and expand on all of those points to give them a little bit more context. And what I'm sort of coming at today is saying, here's some ways to actually put these ideas into practice, because it's great to have a list of principles, but often once they hit some real world, okay, but this is how everybody expects me to do things, and then I don't see how I can make that fit within those principles. How can we actually start to bridge that gap? And 2 weeks ago, did the presentation on the micro nursery that I sort of worked on, and how I did that, because I do think things like micro nurseries and small replicable service models are one of the big changes we need to make, so things can become more local and support sort of more local employment, and also you can have more local adaptation to the capacities of the local ecosystem, and also what is locally available, what is appropriate for the local space, so you can start to get much more adaptive and responsive when it comes to plant species and so forth. Just also still letting a couple more people as they're coming into the room. So we did the gathering 2 weeks ago. That was recorded. You can find it on my cultivatedart.com business website, and that's in the blog. If you go to the blog about the micro nursery, there's actually a recording there of the presentation from 2 weeks ago and the conversation that we had. And today I wanted to introduce something I've been putting together about making new gardens. And I'm going to give the short version of this, go through the short version of it. That is actually, I've been putting it together. I haven't made the final recording yet that's going to be shareable, but the idea being this is something that hopefully you can use to share out on social media, share onto your own business website, share wherever. It'll be associated with the Land Care Collective website, but it'll be on YouTube, and so that you can embed the link into your own site if you are offering these services. But it's also something that this is a way to go about making gardens that minimizes the need to extract from other ecosystems and actually cycle some things that are waste products within urban and suburban spaces into the ecosystem where they belong. So it lets us sort of start to layer benefits as opposed to try to do a balancing act between costs and benefits. And this is sort of a very simplified one that's meant to be able to communicate an idea to potential clients. And I would be interested in your feedback as far as, do you think this would resonate with potential clients for you? And I'm thinking I'll do the short version, and then I'll do a longer version that's actually more explanatory for the DIY crowd and for anybody who's actually like, okay, I'd like to do this, but how? I'd like to offer this service because it's a fairly low barrier of entry. You don't need a lot of equipment, and you mostly just need some work and some time to coordinate things, and a little bit of space, but not a ton. So it gives you it can give you some ways to actually start providing services without necessarily having to invest in a whole bunch of materials or equipment or anything else. So I'm just going to, as I said, I'll do a nice, neat recording of this sometime within the next couple of weeks. I was hoping to get it done before, but yeah, life happened. So I'm just going to set this up and then I'll do a screen share. All right, so that should do it. So minimizing some stuff here so I can actually see my whole presentation screen. If all's working well, the ecological garden making slide should be up on your screen. If it isn't, toss a comment in the chat and let me know. But ecological garden making. More and more gardeners are making the commitment to plant native species in an effort to support locally native biodiversity. Sorry, I'm going to start that again because my slide wasn't progressing when it was supposed to. Ecological garden making. More and more gardeners are making the commitment to plant native species in an effort to support locally native biodiversity. Something that a lot of people don't know, though, is that there can be a high ecological cost to conventional approaches to creating new garden beds. Since fossil fuels have made it cheap to move material around, replacing soil rather than nurturing it has become so common that most new gardeners don't know that it's possible to cultivate soil health right in the garden rather than extracting it from another ecosystem. But cultivating soil health in place is not only possible, it requires far less energy and sets your new ecosystem up for long-term success. Ecological garden making is based on providing the right conditions and some time for the plants and the soil biology to do most of the work for you. Late summer or early fall is the time to start a new garden. Starting with a trench around the perimeter will separate the new garden from the established plant community. Can't talk today. Late summer or early fall is the time to start a new garden. Starting with a trench around the perimeter will separate the new garden from the established plant community so the new one doesn't get overwhelmed by the existing plants. Everything from the trench, plants, roots, and soil goes right into the new garden. Then comes the disruption of the current plant growth by shallow tilling, solarizing, or shading out the existing plants with a layer of cardboard or a few layers of newspaper or paper leaf bags. That gets topped with locally sourced organic matter, such as kitchen or garden compost or leaves, and topped with a generous layer of arborist wood chips. If available, fresh chips are perfect since they have enough moisture to begin composting right away, and they support fungi that excel at restoring soil organic matter and stabilizing that moisture fluctuations. Seeds for the perennial species that you plan to introduce to the new garden, based on observations of the soil, light, and moisture availability, often require a period of cold weather before germinating, so the sourcing and sowing is most often done in the late fall or early winter. Next spring, the new garden is planted with annual species, flowers, vegetables, or both. A nice thick covering of plants will help accelerate the composting of the wood chips, shade out regrowth from the plants that were there before the new garden was started, and capture nutrients released because of the ecosystem disruption. All that fast annual growth and decomposition will break up compacted soils and rev up soil biological activity in depleted areas. While the soil health is building in the new garden, the perennial seedlings spend their first season in a nursery bed where they can be watered and tended as needed until fall. Enjoy the blooms and the harvest from the annual plants over the course of the summer. And after a hard frost, the annual plants are cut down and composted, and any bits of the pre-existing non-native species that remain are dug. Now the bed is ready and the perennials can be transplanted from the nursery bed into their new ecologically friendly garden. So, does that seem like something that would communicate well to people? And I don't have like an hours and hours of long talk, so you'll have to start giving me some feedback soon, audience. Anyone? It's a very quiet room.
Sandura.
Yes.
We talked 2 weeks ago, and I was telling you that I'm starting a meadow over our geothermal bed. My plan was, there's no trenches been dug. I'm having to get my husband on board as well, because he's not quite as keen as I am. Anyway, what I was planning to do this year was just cardboard, small areas, put either under the cardboard or on top of the cardboard some well composted or well rotted grass clippings from years ago or over the last few years. I don't know whether that should go under or on top, and then putting compost on top. And I was going to plant all my little seedlings in there. Now, I'd be better. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I'd be better off planting annuals this year, but I don't have a trench. Is it too late to dig the trenches in the spring?
No, you can actually trench whenever. It's just rather than tossing. Well, actually, the first question is, what's the plant cover right now? Is it turf? Is it mixed tall grasses? Things like that.
It's just a mix of grass that we've been just cutting and keeping down. It's not a lawn by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not quite sure what would be there if we let it grow.
So because that will probably have some fairly strong rhizomatous grasses, the ones with the really strong sort of running root systems, which are really common in country lawns. I wouldn't take what is in the trench and pile it on top of the cardboard, because that wouldn't give it enough shade. Like, it wouldn't shade it enough. It wouldn't be disrupted enough to stop it from growing. So it would just take off and start growing on top, and you wouldn't have smothered it. Those grasses, which is sort of the point of the cardboard. So if you're making a new bed and you're digging a trench around the existing one, take that stuff from that trench, put it in the new area, and then put the cardboard on top of it. Anything that doesn't have a lot of roots, or, as far as you know, much in the way of a lot of seeds in it, you can put on top of the cardboard. And if you have enough mass that you can actually build it up, and build up a good thick layer, then you can go ahead and plant right in that, especially if it's a nursery bed that then you might be digging things up and moving them later. The reason I really recommend the annuals in between when doing a perennial ecosystem is, or when you're starting with a perennial ecosystem and ending up with a perennial ecosystem, is the existing perennial ecosystem doesn't actually want to go away, and it will fight to survive. So you usually do have to work at digging it out over the next year. And if it's a really tenacious planting, I sometimes, like some of the spots I've worked with, I actually do 2 years of annual planting. It's sort of, I have a moving vegetable garden. So I come in, the vegetable garden's there for a couple of years. There's a whole burst of fertility that's released when you disturb soil. That's why when they first tilled the prairies and they grew these giant plants, and they're like, it's amazing. It's actually a release of stored fertility, and that does start to decline. But annuals are really good at capturing that, and that's sort of the niche that they tend to fill ecologically. But because you don't have to worry about whether you're disturbing their roots, it makes it a lot easier to take out any bits of the existing plants that try to come back over the next year or two. So that's why I really recommend the annuals in between, because you can dig out the plants that you're trying to remove. And often they are some really tenacious grasses that most of which I've been learning to identify grasses. Most of the ones that are the really aggressive spreaders that I'm running into, at least in the areas I'm working with, are European species. So I'm trying to disrupt them and replace them with Ontario species, and if I plant right away, even with the cardboard layers and stuff on top, there's always some that comes up through. And if I have other plants, I can't get that out as effectively as if it's annuals, and I can go through and do any disruption I want in the fall. So that's why I recommend the annuals.
That sounds good. My only issue is with that is that it's far away from a water source, and I could happily grow vegetables over there.
So you can, it really is just any annual cover. So you can plant whatever you think would be adapted to the space that you're fine with disturbing then in the fall. You could even just get a cover crop mix from or something like buckwheat and plant it that way, plant it like that. And then if it doesn't really thrive, it's okay, because if it's too stressed for them, it's probably also too stressed for the other plants that are coming up, like it's that dry. But if you do actually lay down a whole bunch of leaves or wood chips or that, those areas tend to hold moisture quite well, and you'd be amazed how drought resistant the space can be. Even if you just plant something like some potatoes or squash or things like that are actually, especially winter squash, that you can sort of ignore all summer and then just go out in the fall and collect squash.
Sounds good. What about, just quickly, what about all the rotted, we've got this pile of rotting grass. Can I put that under the cardboard?
You can put it under or over. And actually, I've been saying for a while, because I work the soil I'm working with out in Perth Gardens, it's sand and silt. There's almost there's less than 1% clay, so it has very little capacity to hold moisture. And there's fairly limited organic matter. It's a low organic matter soil. So I've been sort of taking the approach of, if it rots, I can turn it into soil. So a lot of times people are like, oh, I don't want to use hay, it's got seeds in it. I'm like, I'll take the hay. Because especially if it's an area I'm going to be tending for a year or two, I can pull out anything that comes up. And honestly, with the wood chip layer over top, I really haven't even had that much sprouting from hay. So
thank you.
Yep, if you've got something,
on the right path. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So somebody's saying, I found people like this in theory, but don't like the idea of having to wait a year to get what they want, and suggestions on how to nudge them towards doing that in the way you suggested. So a couple things. One is, that's why to fill the gardens with annuals their first year. They get a nice showy garden. You start it in the fall, next summer they have a nice showy garden. They get, and especially if you plant it with a lot of species that are popular with bees, so sunflowers and cosmos and the large flowered zinnias, and cleome is the spider plant, not the house plant, but the other one they call spider plant. All these are native to this continent, although some a bit further south. Some of the amaranth species, a lot of these things are very attractive to a lot of pollinators and wildlife. So they'll get that immediate, oh, look at all of the flowers and butterflies, and they get that enjoyment out of it in the first year. And while the plants for their garden are being custom grown for them. So they don't have to wait for the garden to do a lot of composting. The plants are growing in it right away. And really we do this because it actually is really costly, ecologically costly, to go to a peat bog and dig out the black earth that makes up the bulk of that garden soil you're buying. It's not something we make. We dig it out of ecosystems and we bring it in. We don't have to do that. So not only is it the digging it out of the ecosystem, it's also all the fossil fuels that it takes for that excavation, and all the transportation, and then hauling away whatever comes out of the garden. So I tend to combine it with, this is ecologically friendly, and that is actually really ecologically costly. And if your goal is to support the ecosystem, because I think the audience, the client base for a lot of this is the gardeners who are starting to think a lot about pollinators and native habitat, things like that. The fact that we're extracting and hauling organic matter into the cities where organic matter is extremely plentiful, so much that we're disposing of it, it does take a little bit of telling that story. But I think the audience that is looking for pollinator gardens and habitat are ready to buy into, we can do things differently, especially if it's told as a narrative of, well, you know, it's going to custom grow the plants. It's much easier to put that, to start them in a nursery bed area while you have the soil developing and coming to life, we can compost all that existing plant matter in, as opposed to throwing it away and then having to bring more in, which has all kinds of associated climate and ecological costs. And you get flowers right away. You actually have a showier garden the first year than you would if you just planted it with the perennials in the spring. The glue and the cardboard. Yeah, that's one of those ones that it's complicated. It's not a perfect solution, but I haven't actually found a perfect solution yet. I do try to get taped cardboard boxes mostly, and then as opposed to ones that are glued together, and remove the tape before they go down. Another good source of cardboard is anywhere that ships a lot of stuff that's in paper bags but on skids. So think like pet food, some feed stores, things like that. They often put a sheet of cardboard on the skid to protect the paper bags from the wood or the plastic skid. Those don't tend to have any tape or glue or dye or anything on them, and if you can get those are awesome. And also some of the stuff that is, I actually have pulled a lot out of the card with permission of a lot of cardboard out of one of the recycling dumpsters at the Just Food Farm, from a place that actually buys a lot of organic food. And so that's the packaging that organic food came in. And so I'm hoping at least that it's more likely to be food safe. It isn't a perfect solution yet. But the other thing is, sometimes, and I've actually saved, if you collect bags of leaves from your neighbors who are silly enough to throw away leaves in the fall, those paper bags are considered compost grade. So that is something that's sort of already got to have plant-based dyes and so forth in it. So that's also another source. If you know any bakeries, especially like organic bakeries that use a lot of flour that they get in paper bags, like the big heavy paper bags, if you can find them, I'm figuring that's going to be a food grade material as well. So you can be a little bit picky about the cardboard. And I'll admit, I actually worry more about all the microplastics shedding off of all of the floating row cover than I do over the cardboard. But it can be complicated. So I have not, somebody's asking, I have not tried this method. Do you think the grass roots actually break down in the soil? So yes and no. There's a reason for the annual plantings. So what I've done, and this has come out of doing this, is I do the trench, pile that in. I usually, because I'm working with a very low organic matter soil, if I can find like rotted hay, stuff that's no longer feed grade, I lay that down. So the plant layer from the trench goes right in the bed. I put the rotting hay on top of it, or whatever else I can get my hands on that's breaking down organic matter. That's where if it rots, I can turn it into soil comes from. And then I put the cardboard down. I'll usually go back through the trench and dig out a little bit more soil. Sorry, I see somebody's in the waiting room. Let me let them in. Second. So I pile some, yeah, if I can dig a little bit deeper in the trench, in some spots I garden, I can only dig like this deep before it's rock, so I'm just limited. I'll take any extra soil that I can take with the trench, toss that on top of the hay to help it start breaking down, just to spread more biology in it. Put the cardboard on top and put the wood chips on top of that. Most of the root matter will break down. And then, sorry, I'm trying to pull a question back up. Not cooperating. Sorry, I'm having technical issues with my screen here. There we go. So yeah, I put down the hay. If there's any soil I can dig out, I put that on top of the hay. I put the cardboard down and I cover it with wood chips. And then the next year, like I'll go through, I have one of those sort of planting knives, punch holes in the cardboard, drop the potatoes, if they're small ones, or potato bits in through the holes, and they'll grow up through it. Some bits of grass can sometimes pop up around, but mostly the annuals provide a lot of competition, and a lot of the mass of the that really thick turf that you can't really pull the roots out of because everything's tangled in and it's holding each other up, most of that breaks down. What remains are the rhizomes, those really strong pieces of grass roots that are the horizontal stems that the pieces pop back up from. Those are what remain, but because everything else is rotted around them, if you go into the garden fork, loosen that spot, pull it out, you can pull them out and pull that whole chunk of roots out and it's just the roots. You don't have, you're not taking up all that other organic matter. I would say 90+% of it does break down, and then you clean out that last 10%. And honestly, I have a tendency to just chuck it on the pathways, the spots I'm walking regularly, until it finishes thoroughly dying, and then it can go into the next garden build. When you plant potatoes, for instance, do you dig a hole down through the layer and put them into the grass below the cardboard? You just put them. So yeah, I do punch holes in the cardboard when I'm planting, because there's just not enough on top. But I literally just punch a hole and I either chuck plant in or chuck potato root in, or even just tuck seeds in, because I'll often plant squashes and beans and corn and things like that. You know, I punch a hole, I tuck a seed in, I go on, punch a hole, tuck a seed in, and give it a good water, and they come up. So they provide most of the competition, most of the composting happens, and then that fall cleanup, when you go after the frost, you can find the bits that have come back up and you can follow them through and get their roots out, and the roots will come out much more cleanly, and you'll be removing a small fraction of the organic matter that you would have removed otherwise. Somebody's saying thank you, that sounds satisfying. Yes, it actually is. It's actually, you get the pieces out, you get the bits out, and you will find a lot of permaculture sort of narratives about, well, just put down the cardboard and then you cut holes and you plant through it. And I've tried that, and especially if there's like the really running the European brome grasses and that, which are those ones you see all along the sides of the road, they're really common. They have such a strong root system that they can stay buried for a year or so, and they'll pop up as soon as the cardboard starts to break down. But those are the ones that you can pull out, because if you've grown it as annuals, you don't have to worry about disturbing the roots of your plants. You're doing it in the fall. You can get the last bits of those out, and then you have a good planting area that doesn't get overrun in a couple of years with those. And I've seen so many sort of food forest projects and ones where they've done sort of the big group build and gone out, spread the cardboard, put the wood chips and put the plants through, and then over 2 or 3 years they just get overwhelmed again. If you put in that interruption of some annual plantings for a year or two, I've dealt with some really, really pushy grass species, and actually I'm working with a patch right now that's the Canary reed grass, which has a hugely heavy rhizome. And even I started about midsummer last year, and I did one sort of pull out later in the summer, but I actually think that by the end of next summer, those roots will have all broken down enough that you can go right to at sort of just past 1 year planting permanent gardens. Yes, actually the question about does a cardboard break down in one season? There's a couple of things around cardboard. If you're dealing with a really strong root system and a thriving ecosystem, you probably need cardboard because it's not going to give up very easily. In those systems, you probably have lots of thriving biology, which is going to go, cardboard, this is carbohydrates, I'm eating this. and it breaks down very quickly. I've actually had holes start to open in the cardboard if I pull back the mulch within as little as 2 months in areas that are really thriving. As long as there's enough moisture, and then the biology will just start eating it. You'll start to see actual tracks chewed through the underside of the cardboard. So the cardboard can break down very quickly in those really biologically active spaces. If you have a really urban space with a really sort of thin lawn, I would probably take the shallow tilling approach and maybe put down like some newspaper or a layer of leaf bags, but that's about it, because those roots are too weak to really regenerate very much. And you probably don't have enough biology going on to really eat through heavy cardboard in a short period of time. You might find there's still cardboard left there. So put down as heavy a suppression that's in proportion to how strong the plant growth is. So if the plants are thriving, you probably need cardboard, because they're going to be like, no, I'm going to come through anything else. And if it's a system that's struggling and you're actually trying to introduce extra vitality by getting a big full annual garden going and getting the organic matter from the wood chips and that into the space, you probably don't need much. You might not need cardboard at all, because the ecosystem is just not going to eat it very fast. So there's another question. Yeah, so the cardboard will break down in a season if you have a thriving system, and if you don't, you probably don't need the cardboard. So the cardboard and chips go down in the spring, and then annuals right away, and then it's the fall, it's ready for plants. So best case scenario, ideal world, you start these in sort of late summer or in the fall. And the reason for that is there is some sort of initial breaking down that does seem to, if people often will say, don't put down wood chips, they steal all your nitrogen. And it's not quite how it works. It's the bacteria that can grow trying to eat all that carbohydrates also needs quite a bit of nitrogen to do that. And so they absorb all that nitrogen in their growth spurt, and then it stays locked up in them, and basically until they're finished that initial stage of breaking down the carbohydrates. So some nutrients can get locked up, but it's actually fairly temporary. And then once they start to die off, all those nutrients that they got from breaking down all that organic matter of the plants and any of the wood chips and anything else you put down, even just from the first stages of breaking down, that starts to get released. And if you can start it in the fall, it comes spring, you are at the stage of things already being released. So you will get much more abundant growth and more thorough composting over the course of the summer. If it was in an area that didn't have a strong, thriving ecosystem already, I'd say you can probably get away with an early spring start plant, growing it for a season, and then be ready to put the perennials in the fall. Alternatively, you could say, okay, well, I'm going to start the spring. I'm going to seed sort of late spring, early summer, and then I'm going to do a second, and then I'm going to start my perennials in the fall, and then do a second season of annual growth in the gardens, because it's not like you're necessarily waiting. That can be an awesome garden. Like that's a lot of my vegetable garden will be for the next several years, this sort of moving garden, and coming in behind it will be sort of the more food forest and perennial plantings. But it's not just wasting or waiting space. This is my garden. I'm eating from that. And it also means that I'm not spending a lot of time fighting with trying to suppress the weeds. The new gardens are covered with all the wood chips, and then the more mature gardens are going to become perennial again. So it cuts down on sort of my weeding intensity as well. So ideally, you start the process in the late summer or early fall. River wash stone and landscape fabric underneath. Yes, so what do you do about the river wash, the rocks in the gardens? In a lot of ways, the rocks aren't the problem, it's the fabric. And the only way to get it out is to get it out. So you can actually grow, there's actually a lot of perennials that are fully adapted to growing in situations where there's a layer of gravel on the top and there's soil underneath, and that actually tends to be higher moisture situations that tend to occur under that. There's a lot of sort of slightly wetland plants that actually thrive in that area. People tend to think of rocks as arid gardens, but that's, you know, xeriscaping came out of Colorado, and there was in an area that had an annual average rainfall of 14 inches. We have more like 36 inches of average annual rainfall in Ottawa. So in areas where there's very little water, rocks on the surface fit with an arid ecosystem. In areas with very wet conditions, and we are considered a fairly wet ecosystem here in the Ottawa area, that's actually closer to wetland plants are more used to growing with some rocks on the surface and soil underneath. So you can grow plant, you don't actually necessarily have to get rid of all the rocks, but you do need to get rid of the fabric layer, which can kind of be a matter of pushing it over. And a lot of plants actually can be planted in amongst those. But also keep in mind that you want, if you're trying to create a garden in an area that has a lot of river stone, and you're going to go ahead and garden in it, you need to plant densely, because gravel and small stones and the spaces between stones are amazing nursery spots for seeds, because they sort of protect them from the wind, and they hold a little bit of moisture, and they let the roots anchor easily. And that means that if you don't fill the space with everything that you want there or your client wants there, Mother Nature will be like, you missed a spot, let me help you with that, and we'll plant something for you. So you can do very dense plantings, and sort of even mimic almost rain garden, what you might think of as rain garden plantings, and really fill it in though. But you can plant in those spots without removing the river rock, but you do need to remove the fabric. And yes, you are absolutely right. Landscape fabric with river rock over it is not a low maintenance garden in this climate. It's an extremely high maintenance garden, because that fabric becomes a really good thing for roots to anchor into, and they will. And you can also put the river wash into dry if you're trying to just relocate it on the site and turn areas into just garden areas. You can start to go, where are the downspouts, where are the areas where water would be washing through, which will actually wash soil out between the rocks and any seeds in that accumulate. So the landscape space that's appropriate for having exposed rocks that aren't full of plants is pretty much, in this climate, just areas where water will actually flow through and wash it. They call it river wash, which it means washing. So swale areas and routes from downspouts towards rain gardens or swale areas, you can effectively put down river wash and have it work fairly well. Any other questions? I seem to be running out of questions in the chat. Is anybody running into, I want to do this better, but the clients want this, and I don't have any idea of how to actually do it in a green way? I'm actually kind of curious what issues people are running into. I'm looking at supply chain stuff a lot for myself when it comes to, you know, the plant sourcing. I go, oh, there's all these problems around it. And I'm kind of going around the soil sourcing, like, why are we even moving soil around? So here's a way to go about making a garden that is capturing what is otherwise waste material, and directing it into the soil where it becomes a resource for the plants and for all the rest of the ecosystem. But there's a lot of other aspects to gardening and horticulture. Are there any that you're running into or thinking about? Getting rid of goutweed. So that list, I have to actually find a patch of something that's like really noxious at some point, that somebody wants to actually try out that sort of cardboard and mulch annuals dig out approach on. I suspect, and the really pushy plants, it would be a minimum of a 2-year process. I suspect that it would work. So same principles. You have to put a trench around because a lot of plants respond to stress or suppression by running somewhere else. They'll extend their root system out, and go pop up beyond the disruption. So you have to trench to limit that reaction. And then you smother it with the cardboard, and you provide lots of competition with annuals. And then you do a dig through to remove the regrowth that fall, and then you repeat the process. You might even put down an extra layer of cardboard that fall. If you get some more wood chips, top it up again, plant annuals again the next year. And by then you're going to have the gout weed or anything else is going to be really starting to decline. The catch is this approach does mean anything that's there that you want to keep, you actually have to lift, clear out any of the gout weed bits around the roots, and plant them elsewhere for the duration. But as I said, rhizomatous grasses and other rhizomatous species, they all have that sort of, if they try to run away, so the trenching is really important, and they can take a couple of years to subside, but it is possible to get them to subside. You need to give them the competition though, and then you need to be repeating the disturbance. But the grass that I'm working with in the one spot where I've created is one of the beds I'm working on at the Just Food farm that we'll be using in the, will be incorporated to the course I'm teaching next year. The root system on Canary reedgrass is very, very similar to the root system on common reed, on Phragmites, that really aggressive, really problematic invasive species. And you need to, and I'm kind of looking at going, I really do think that you could accomplish, if it works on the reed grass, I think it would work on Phragmites. So the goutweed with its smaller, more fragile root system, I've removed that before just through pure digging and growing a vegetable garden on the spot and then digging it again the next year, and then it was gone, and that was without cardboard. So I think if you add the cardboard in and keep the space planted with annuals until you're done your removal, it will help. Horsetail, somebody mentioned horsetail. So horsetail will be one of the interesting and trickier ones. The mulch that horsetail thrives in is actually the really fine composted sort of landscape appearance mulch. And what part of what makes it really tricky is that the dark color of the runners of horsetail, the root structure for them and their stems, makes them blend really well with soil and mulch, and also they're really brittle. So of all of the things, that's actually like a completely different, it's a completely different type of plant. And they will probably be the hardest one. And I don't have a perfect solution for you for horsetail, although I will be gardening at Just Food over the coming years as part of the courses, the learning land character courses I'll be teaching. So I'm going to be able to experiment with a few things around dealing with horsetail. The other couple of thoughts is it is a native species, and if it's really out competing the other plants, there's probably something else going on in the ecosystem that's limiting the capacity of the other plants to thrive, because horsetail, except in wet areas or areas of where there's certain soil conditions going on that are particularly conducive to its growth, which tend to not be conducive to the growth of a lot of other things. So that it's probably going to be a more complicated sort of figuring out when it comes to horsetail. And I would also start to go, is the ecosystem we're trying to create there the right one? If horsetail is thriving, maybe we actually need to be thinking of, is this the right ecosystem for this spot? Again, a common ground covers to compete with thriving horsetail. What about common ground covers to coexist with thriving horsetail? I've actually seen some gorgeous photos of horsetail as a ground cover, the really fluffy horsetail as a ground cover amongst other species, because it is a native ground cover. And it's a really neat texture if it grows well and gets thick. And if it is growing well and getting thick, I'd be sort of starting to go, okay, off the top of my head, I'm trying to think if it's acidic or if it's something else, and if it's acidity in the soil, or if there's something else. But I've actually started to look at what ecosystem does it thrive in, what are the other species that actually usually coexists well with, and then starting to just treat it as a garden species. And part of the reason I think a lot of gardens have ended up with horsetail is because we are going into wetlands and digging soil out of them and bringing them into our urban spaces and putting that soil down. And then that's the only one that was able to survive through that degree of disturbance and come in with the soil. And we're trying to grow plants that are not wetland species in wetland soil. And the horsetail's like, no, 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 I belong here. What the heck are the rest of you doing here? So part of that is actually the fact that we are transporting soil from the ecosystem that soil has come from, and where all the plants in that ecosystem engineered that soil to their preferences, and then we brought it into some other space and said, okay, somebody else is going to grow here. And the horsetail's like, yeah, I don't think so. I made this. I'm staying. You moved me, but I'm staying. So you can avoid the whole problem by making gardens the way I just suggested, but also going, why is the horsetail here? If it really is appropriate for it to be here, then what else is it appropriate to plant with? And that also circles back to what I'd sort of said when I did the opening bit about from the principles, the land care principles, is so much of all of this comes back down to observation. What's going on here? Because if there's something going on, there's probably something you can learn from that then you can use to adapt. Sometimes it's just adapt expectations. There's an awful, doing that native plant series I've been doing on Facebook. Fleabane is sort of one that's sort of making me smile, because Fleabane is just like a weed to so many people. And now there's all these people going, isn't that gorgeous? I want it for my garden. I'm about to start, actually, tomorrow's plant's going to be the first of the goldenrods. Is goldenrod a weed or an extremely important ecological plant? And once you actually ask different questions about it, it changes. Sometimes, you might learn, okay, how can I control this? But you also might go, now that I know so much about you, I think you're awesome. Here's some friends. Here's everybody you would normally coexist with. Let's actually pull together the community that you're trying to provide the foundation for. So we can actually often see opportunities and see possibilities that were just not on the table until we sort of pause and go, well, why are you here? And is this the place you belong? And if it is, then how does your belonging become part of the care plan in this space? And if you are getting a little bit too pushy for your neighbors, do we change your neighbors, or do we adjust something about the space so that your neighbors are thriving more? Like, often it's not about just control the one thing, it's nudge the system. And sometimes the thing that needs the nudge is our expectations. Anything else? So yeah, are wood chips best sourced from arborists? Now, when I say arborist wood chips, I don't care whether or not they're a licensed arborist. It's not some fancy thing that I licensed arborists know or don't. The reason I say arborist wood chips is there's a lot of forestry product mulch that it's transported long distance. It's coming from other ecosystems. We're moving a lot of things around. And also it's very often single species mulch. We literally advertise it for that. And it's usually softwood. It's pine or cedar, and this further south you'll get into cypress mulches, and they'll be listed as specifically that. And one of the important things to that I've learned over the years about building soil biology is the more diversity of the inputs, the more diversity of the biology. So that means diversity of plant species growing in it, but it also the organic matter coming in. If it's really diverse, you'll tend to get very diverse soil biology, which is great. It tends to be more resilient to disease and more adaptable. So the reason I say arborist wood chips is you're more likely to get a mixed species load. You're also going to get fresh. And especially if there's a lot of the smaller branches that get chipped, they tend to have a lot of sapwood in them. Sort of anything under about a 3-inch diameter it's something we call Raymeal wood chips. And there's been a whole bunch of research done around these, and they help support, and it's hardwood that's sort of the smaller size. So it has a certain amount of bark in it, and the cambium layer, and also the sapwood, and not so much heartwood. And often even has leaves in it. And so that actually starts to compost very quickly. And it also grows white fungus, which can be multiple species, but that tends to be really good at building up the soil organic matter and the capacity for the soil to hold moisture. It makes sort of this really spongy, rich soil. So the soil that you actually, and the biology that actually develops when you start with arborist wood chips, as opposed to a single species and often softwood as opposed to hardwood, but young hardwood, it just tends to be that much better. You will still end up with some softwood if you're just getting arborist chips. And a good way to do that in urban spaces is if you check out Chip Drop, I think it's .com, they might have a .ca. You can actually just put your address in and say, I'll accept a load of wood chips dropped on my driveway. And the catch is you don't know when it's going to show up or what it exactly is going to be, but it's basically arborists can go on when they're doing work in the area and go, is there somewhere I can drop these chips? So you're getting super local and you're getting it into the garden. You're cycling a waste product back into the local ecosystem, and it does tend to be very good for building soil. So actually, this is perfect. So I got a load of wood chips dropped off. I had signed the first place up for Chip Drop. In urban spaces, you can sign up for Chip Drop and you can have a load of chips off and show up in a week or two. In rural spaces, you sign up for something like Chip Drop, where people don't have a lot of trees chipped, because who's going to pay to chip something when you can just toss it on the back 40, or you're going to cut it up and use it for your own stuff. Or if you're paid to have it chipped, it's because you want wood chips for something. So people aren't trying to dispose of wood chips the same way in rural spaces as they are in urban spaces. But I did get a load last summer. It was great. It's like pulled in one day and there was a load of wood chips right in the spot I'd said, that's the spot to dump wood chips. And they were buckthorn, which if you've ever tried to chip buckthorn, which I have, it's really stringy. And there's often then it's thorny because it's called buckthorn for a reason. And it's often full of berries. And I'm like, my favorite use for buckthorn in the landscape. I spread it on the gardens, and then any of the bits that pop up again. And this is where doing that year of annual gardening in the spot first really makes a difference, because that means you're going through and you're pulling everything in the fall. You can just cut the annuals off. You don't have to pull the roots up, but you can see what's there. And so you can pull the seedlings from the trees. And often if it's been sitting for 9 months, they've probably already started to germinate, and just moving the mulch around is actually going to disrupt them anyway. So it's actually, to me, having invasive species mulched and then putting them in a spot where you're going to grow annuals for a couple of years is perfect, because it actually lets the seeds germinate, and then you disrupt the seedlings and then they're done. It removes the siege and the genetic sort of resurgence of them from the ecosystem, while keeping all the organic matter in the ecosystem. So I love chipping invasive species and then using them in my gardens. It gives me a great way to put the invasive species back into the ecosystem in a way that actually is helpful rather than harmful to the ecosystem. So by all means, chip the invasives. They make excellent compost. We are coming up to about an hour, and you've probably all been listening to me chatter for just about long enough. Any last questions before we wrap it up? Okay, well, I really will get around to making a recording of that. I'm hoping that people will find it useful as a means to start to communicate with, hey, we can offer this type of garden making service for you. And it's a little bit of a standalone, but actually it ties in with if you're going to do design services for people, if you're going to grow out local seedlings, if you're going to provide garden sort of coaching and guidance for how to care for an ecological garden. So this is just one piece of the puzzle. There's lots of other pieces that need to be put in before we actually have a land care sort of livelihood network that can actually meet the needs that would need to be met for land care to become sort of a full livelihood ecosystem. So because the weather's probably going to start to warm up again, not too distant future, and my weekends are going to be back out in Perth. I'm not going to wait 2 weeks till the next one. I'm going to do another one of these next week. So next Saturday, same time, 2 o'clock, with a specific discussion around design services, because I think design services as they're currently structured are actually can be unfortunately very limiting. But I think the service of helping people decide what they need or what to do to start the process of restoring urban ecosystems, there's so much guidance that people need to get them started. But the design process that has actually grown out of very conventional garden practices and landscape expectations, I don't think is well suited. And again, keeping in mind, for those of you who don't know, I worked as a professional designer for 18 years. So this isn't me going, oh no, you're not doing it right. This is me going, there's some issues, and they actually limit the possibility for urban ecosystems to become really regenerative and sustainable. And they also, I think, limit the potential for homeowners and gardeners to develop a relationship with their ecosystem. So to sort of lay out where I see the limitations, but also to brainstorm some of the possibilities of how the service model can be adjusted so that those with expertise can help guide people who have land, access to land, towards how we go through decision-making processes in ways that actually really cultivate sort of a reciprocal and sustainable relationships. So how do we shift from ordering the landscape what to be to providing guidance? Somebody's asking, how often do you recommend showing up? I wanted a wildflower garden and calls back, sees wild rhubarb coming up again. So how often do you show up at garden sites? Well, I'll be on, how often do I intervene on garden sites? Let's say that, because I show up and look at my garden fairly often, because have you seen all the photos I take? I think gardens are awesome to go and look at up close, but that's my gardens and I have time to. Intervention, if you show up once a month, you're going to get anything before it has a chance to seed. So once a month, if you're providing a service, is plenty to check things. And then any major interventions, as far as like really, I do most of my garden weeding in April, and I often do a little bit in October. And then I always leave a few patches in the garden unmulched. I do mulch my annual gardens. They can talk about that some other time if you want, because I think everybody gets it backwards. We shouldn't mulch our perennial gardens. They should be full of plants. We should mulch our annual gardens because they have bare soil, but we do the opposite. And I'm like, no. So the only spots I really have tons of weeding to do are the few gaps I do leave in the mulch so that it grows lots of lamb's quarters, because that's the best breed I grow in my place. And then I weed it and then I put it in the freezer. But yeah, I think once a month, it will probably be sufficient for most spaces. You can stay ahead of anything that comes up that might seed. And then the major weeding is really just spring and fall. If you've got mulched gardens, you don't have to do much to them through the summer other than like pick all your veggies and enjoy all your flowers. That's actually why I do most of my garden making I actually usually end up doing it in August, because the gardens don't need anything from me in August. And then the big harvest, a lot of it for me happens in September, and I don't want to be doing garden making in September. I'm busy processing harvest. So it's also, I've adapted some of these things because they actually suit my schedule, and I found out that it actually works really well to make gardens in August. All right, well, I think that probably wraps it up. Thanks everybody for coming and spending a chunk of your Saturday afternoon thinking about these things. And oh, as I was saying, the question about how we actually design spaces and go through design practices, we'll delve into that a bit next Saturday. And I am going to directly tag a bunch of people who I know do designing and see who wants to show up and actually have those conversations. So even if you just want to show up and sort of lurk and listen to that conversation, perfectly fine. I'm going to try to rope in and have a little bit more of a conversation session around that next week, because I don't have all the answers to this yet, but I think it's one of the tough nuts we need to crack, that if we can crack that, we can actually then use it as a catalyst for shifting how the rest of sort of service models work around garden and land relationships. All right, so that will be next week, same time, same place. All right, bye everybody.